Kyrgyzstan society is very diverse. There are over 100 different ethnic groups living in Kyrgyzstan, over a dozen different religions, and Kyrgyzstan society has several languages spoken by minority groups. The largest minority group is ethnic Uzbeks, followed by Russians, and then Dungans, Tatars, Uyghurs. Kyrgyzstan's society is also divided between rural, urban, and newly urban groups. You can see how those groups are different in their socioeconomic status, in the language they speak, in the type of job they do. So those are the rough the cleavages in the society. There are also regional differences that are sometimes used for political purposes. One of the most cited regional differences between the south of the country and the north of the country, and people from both parts of the country would claim that they have some cultural differences between them. The way the Soviets defined ethnicity as being biologically predefined and attached to a certain territory, and basically very rigid definition, still persists today strongly in the minds of politicians and society. So even though some politicians are trying to move away from the Soviet legacy of doing politics, of treating the society, those concepts of ethnicity being the main identity marker for an individual and for a group and for a society in general are still very much very important in the way the politics is done. And it's also quite important in everyday politics, especially during political uncertainties. People resort to this very rigid, very dogmatic perception, understanding of ethnicity. And this is something that will take time to overcome for Kyrgyzstan, if Kyrgyzstan wants to become a diverse country where civic rights are more important than ethnic background. I think the biggest challenge in Kyrgyzstan today is underrepresentation of ethnic minority groups and of women. Kyrgyzstan is more politically open today compared to 3 years ago. And we've seen competitive elections. We see entrepreneurship growing in Kyrgyzstan. But the political rights, political liberties are not spread evenly across the society. And the majority ethnic group, the Kyrgyz, they enjoy those political freedoms to a greater extent than ethnic minorities. Although ethnic minorities have access to market economy, to entrepreneurship, they still feel politically unprotected, and they face greater uncertainty in the future because of that. And I think that in itself breeds tensions. So political exclusion of ethnic minority groups creates uncertainty in the future for these minority groups. It alienates them from the political process in Kyrgyzstan overall. Whereas quite good political representation of ethnic majority sort of reinforces the notion that ethnic Kyrgyz are the state-making ethnic group, the so-called, the Soviet concept of state-making people for Kyrgyzstan, and it breeds this ground where ethnic majority enjoys both political representation and access to market resources, whereas ethnic minorities, they only enjoy access to market resources, but they can't defend their private property, they can't defend their interest on a political level. And in the future, this might create tensions between not so much ethnic lines, but between private property owners who are not represented politically and those who are represented politically. But this can easily turn into ethnic tensions in the future. So any ethnic violence is a very complex phenomenon. And when it comes to Kyrgyzstan in June 2010, there were several factors in interplay. First, there was no central government, no legitimate central government after the regime change in April 2010. There was also widespread poverty. So one of the reasons for tensions, buildup of tensions, is overall poverty in southern Kyrgyzstan. And third, because of just political chaos and uncertainty in Kyrgyzstan, different groups, and especially ethnic majority and ethnic minority groups, they had misconceptions of their political interest, economic interest in this environment of uncertainty overall. And there were several mistakes made by the members of interim government, which ignored possible buildup of tensions along interethnic lines. There were also rumors, and there was political disalignment of southern. Of the population in southern Kyrgyzstan with the processes that were taking place in northern parts of the country. And this all, at one point, became a, this all sort of overlapped at one point, and just one spark, a fight in a nightclub sparked wider interethnic tensions, and the government was not able to halt it right there. Once it spread in southern Kyrgyzstan, and it took about 4 days for the government to be able to mobilize troops and stop the violence. I think it's very important for Kyrgyzstan to continue this tradition of having an independent parliament that over time is becoming more and more skillful in holding civil political debate over important national issues, and leverage on the experience of this very important and unique for the entire region experience of holding competitive elections. So in a couple of years, in about 2 years, there's going to be another parliamentary elections in Kyrgyzstan, and it is important to make them even more competitive and be even more inclusive in terms of including more representatives of, I think, minority groups and women into party lists. And if those elections in 2 years are as competitive or more competitive and fair and transparent compared to the ones in 2010, 2011, then I think Kyrgyzstan has a good chance of becoming a democratic country in the foreseeable future. So the next elections are going to be an important benchmark for Kyrgyzstan. It's a very tough challenge for the government to build a nation because Kyrgyzstan society is so diverse. On the one hand, they should continue promoting the importance and the status of the Kyrgyz language so that the entire population speaks the language, because it is the language of the majority group, and it will facilitate communication on the state level, on the society level in Kyrgyzstan in the future. But on the other hand, by promoting the language and maybe some other attributes of the state, the government should really emphasize the importance of civic rights ahead of ethnic rights or ethnic belonging. So civic rights should be equal, should be should be equal for all groups, regardless of their ethnic background, or however people want to identify themselves, be that along ethnic lines, gender, family, professional, or other identities. So it is a very difficult balance, and it will take a lot of effort on the part of the government to be able to hold this balance. The Kyrgyz government's attempt to enforce inclusiveness of all ethnic and cultural groups in Kyrgyzstan by adopting a specific policy document is a very bold attempt, given that the memory of ethnic conflict is still fresh in Kyrgyzstan. By adopting this document on national unity, the government tried to balance between the interests and the needs of ethnic majority groups and concerns of ethnic minority groups. And one of the positive moments in this particular policy is that it doesn't explain what happened in June 2010 as being necessarily driven by inter-ethnic tensions, but it looks beyond ethnic identities. It looks into some of the economic and cultural changes in southern Kyrgyzstan that led to conflict, to violence. However, the policy is still limited because it continues to appeal to some of the Soviet ways of defining ethnicity as being a very rigid concept, as being the primary identity of any person or group. And it often, the policy ignores some of diversities that might exist within ethnic groups. And it ignores the question that ethnicity does not necessarily have to be the main identity marker, and it does not have to lead group, the way group acts, behavior of a group or an individual. But again, it's quite an innovative idea on looking into inclusiveness in Kyrgyzstan, and it does try to develop a new identity based on civic rights. Whether it will be successful is another question, but it's a bold attempt and it's worth it. In terms of pluralism, Kyrgyzstan is quite a divided society, culturally divided society. There is more pluralistic, more inclusive Bishkek in northern Kyrgyzstan, where ethnic belonging or religious belonging does not really matter that much, and people are free to identify themselves with whatever group or whatever religious denomination they want, and they probably will not encounter much trouble in everyday life. When it comes to southern Kyrgyzstan, where the memory of conflict, inter-ethnic conflict is still fresh, it's not that easy to be an ethnic minority. And there is discrimination, everyday discrimination, reinforced by local government and just by the peoples themselves. So it is a divided society, but given that Kyrgyzstan today is politically open and hopefully will stay this way, if this culture of Bishkek, of northern Kyrgyzstan, spreads across the country, then there are more hopes for a pluralistic society in Kyrgyzstan.